it brings us in the book of Proverbs to a place where we want to know. When we experience trauma, the terrors, the nightmares, the recurring events, something happens and all these triggers create images, create thoughts that seem to be virtually uncontrollable. And so we find ourselves in a desperate moment of trauma, unable to make decisions or move because of having been overtaken. Now, Proverbs says when you lay down, you're going to sleep, and have no fear when sudden disaster comes. For the Lord is on your side and will keep you from being snared. Commit to the Lord whatever you do. He'll establish your plan. Victory over trauma. I'm starting with this so that I don't lose someone on the front end, because we're going to step into the ash heap in just a minute. But knowing that anxiety weighs down the heart, but a kind word cheers it up, I want to begin by victory over trauma, maintaining your faith even in the dark, even when you can't see. And there are numerous psalms in which David, other psalmists, other writers, Job, cry out to God because they couldn't see how he's working this thing out. Proverbs 4, let your eyes look straight ahead. Give careful thought to the path of your feet and be steadfast. Well, that feels strong, and that is a very determined way that I think each and every one of us intend to live. And yet we might have found ourselves doubting when we enter the darkness. There's a quote, I think Frederick Buechner, never doubt in the darkness what your faith has shown you in the light. So, standing in the ashes, finding hope where trauma has shattered your world. Yeah, everything changed. The things that were are no more, or they have been altered. Generally not by your own actions, but could have been. But regardless of how, trauma is not something that's just in your head. It alters your thinking. It alters the process of how we feel. And at the end of the day, we have to minister. And so we'll begin early on. Happy is the man who finds wisdom and the man who gains understanding. We all want to be that person that finds that. And we realize that this sense of contentment and wisdom is more valuable than any proceeds of gold and silver. So when we talk about Job, he lost everything, all of that. But we're saying that trauma, while we're in the ashes, we have to have direct contact, administration. We need one to minister to us, information into the trauma. And we'll talk a little bit about how we minimize and say things we ought not. Job's friends did that. But thinking through reality, the Lord by wisdom founded the earth. By understanding, he established the heavens. By his knowledge the depths were broken up and the clouds dropped down the dew. My son, let them not depart from your eyes. Keep sound wisdom and discretion, so they will be your life to your soul and grace to your neck. Then you will walk safely in your ways, and your foot will not stumble. But he says this, do not be afraid when terror comes, nor when trouble from the wicked when it comes. There's going to be trauma. There's a circumstance in which we're going to experience that trauma. Don't be afraid of sudden terror. The Lord is your confidence. Verse 26, he will keep your foot from being caught. Then he talks in the very next verse, do not withhold good from those to whom it is due. A person that experienced trauma oftentimes no longer experiences the expression of good to others. Because they have been traumatized, they withhold that good. And in this study, we're discovering that one of the first things we begin to do is communicate. But must be according to the will and word of God. Our spiritual mind decompression chamber. What we just read, God meets us in our physical panic and provides pathways to calm that nervous system, the outward man perishing, the inward man being renewed day by day. And we can get out of a survival mode and back into the state of safety. Now, you have survival mode in that life is fragile and it's lost. But the state of safety is not in the fact that life can be lost, but the inward person being renewed day by day. But through trauma, through these experiences or through that experience, whatever it may be, that trauma can cause us to normalize deep anger. And that's where we lose that ability to share good with those that we have within our power to give, but we don't. And we lay it at the feet of our trauma. Our life view must return to trust. Because that's the path to seek that safe space to process the pain. Because much of the trauma that seeks to get out or stay in, it screams out at times, is implanted and is not allowed to be released because it has altered a worldview that keeps one in bitterness, and they never process the pain. So we take the impact. And what we mean by the impact is we come to the place in the ash heap. Our sense of security, our vision for the future, they've all been stripped. Job sits physically in the ash heap with his friends, and he's there scraping his sores, in total silence for 7 days. They were traumatized by his trauma. And so we see in the theater of the book of Job something that occurs in possibly the life of every individual to some extent. The impact is there. It takes the words out of our mouths. In fact, that verse there in chapter 2 and verse 8, and they took for himself a potsherd with and scraped himself as he sat in the midst of the ashes. And So they sat down on the ground 7 days and 7 nights, and no one spoke a word to him, as they saw his grief was so great. They were traumatized by his trauma. Now, help us in that reality. Trauma can't be minimized. It's an all-encompassing experience. Suddenly we sit with an uninvited guest, an uninvited truth, and what they call the ministry of presence, where if you've ever had the privilege of sitting with someone and they've experienced loss or a terrible diagnosis or something of that nature, the ministry of presence. So many people want to know, what can we do? What can we do? What can we do? Be there. Say nothing. At this point in this friendship, they were just traumatized by his trauma, and they sat quiet, non-judgmentally, and they didn't offer any quick fix or silver lining. And so what does your ash heap look like right now? And who has safely sat in silence by your side? I'm inviting you to be a part of the local church. Our purpose is to love and to care. Job did finally open up, and this is what he said. He opened his mouth and he cursed the day of his birth. So, suppressed grief and anger turn inward. Keeping the body struck in the state of that survival, we're just stuck there. We're supposed to think on something else. But it's so overwhelming that we seem to have no capability of thinking anything but, I will not retain or restrain my mouth. I will speak in the anguish of my spirit. I will complain in the bitterness of my soul. Job broke his silence, cursed the day of his birth, and vowed to speak out. And remember, Job did not sin in his view toward God. But he experienced everything we read about in those first 2 chapters. Reality set in. Sorrow, crying, protesting, raging, all natural spiritual release valves that God has given us. And God doesn't fear your pain. In fact, we discover that Jesus suffered at all points like as we are, yet without sin. Jesus knows. It may be that in this process you've avoided approaching God. And maybe it's that you're looking at your friends that were there that said the wrong things or didn't do the right things. Stop hiding spiritually from being unfaithful or that you've allowed an event to take you down. Because in your sinfulness, while we were still sinners, Christ died, and the grace of God is right there to bring salvation and to teach you to deny ungodliness and worldly lust, to live sober. Listen to that part. To live soberly, righteously, godly. That's a soberly, righteously, that you got. There's things you don't need that the trauma has told you that you do. And this is where God brings His grace and His mercy and His peace. And it's where you'll find it. And reject the miserable comforters. That is where I apologize to so many people I've talked to. I feel like maybe I've been a miserable comforter. Because when you open your mouth to try to speak to someone's trauma, you can really only administer what the psalmist wrote. But we oftentimes want to give our take on it. And that's what his friends did. They began to give him their intellectualized survivor mentality, and that is that, hey, you got all this raw pain, and it's triggering all of my insecurities. And so, because of my insecurities, let me tell you how I feel about it. Eliphaz came, and he just brought it up this way. He did the victim blaming scenario. Eliphaz claims the innocent never perish. And then prompting Job to call him a miserable comforter. In fact, in the studies, and I'm going to abbreviate a little bit in this study, but through the book of Job and through the study Sunday, hopefully we'll get more in. But this idea that victim blaming, that the reason this happened, the trauma happened to you because it was supposed to. It's your fault. Because you've done something wrong in your past. Oh, what happened to you wasn't it. It was because you did something before. So, that, my friends, you need to build a fortress around yourself and block that out. Draw rigid boundaries against toxic positivity. People want a spiritual bypass and think that your trauma is a direct punishment. Now, you could be suffering from your own sins, but listen, the traumatization of that is externally assimilated and released through what means? God's grace and God's mercy. That's why we're here. And build that fortress. But we have these cliches or phrases and platitudes that project. You got to reject them. You just have to reject them because they're not really for your emotional healing. Those cliches to reject, everything happens for a reason. Well, I mean, while that may be a broad brush to paint a picture with, that's not what the God of heaven. We're instructed in Solomon's writings, in Ecclesiastes, that time and chance happens to us all. And so remove the idea that standing in the ashes that you may have found yourself and shattering your worldview, that it was for a reason and that was to traumatize you. No. That God has set in order the things that exist, and time and chance does happen to all of us, yet God will overrule even the worst of traumatic events. He doesn't, not the cause of evil, but He is definitely the one that overrules evil for a greater good. That statement, God never gives you more than you can handle. Well, explain Job not sinning then when he said, I regret the day that I was born. He had gotten more than he could handle. He couldn't handle what he was dealing with. He would rather have been born a stillborn child. He was given more than he could handle. So, standing in the ashes, trauma, yeah, we've experienced more than we can handle. The other idea is let go and let God. You're not passive in this situation. That's the problem. If you've been traumatized and now you're in the room and you're in the dark place and you're staying in the dark place and you're trying to just let go, no, it's time to get out. Get up and get out of the dark place. Then let go. That is what God is doing. If you're going to let go and let God, then you will immediately be out of your circumstance. And that idea, what doesn't kill you make you stronger, that's a cool song. It's wrong. Yeah. when he's making the statement, what doesn't kill you make you stronger, is evidenced by what occurred in the life of Job. It made him very weak, extremely weak. In fact, there are times where he expresses that he is just a sack of dust. Didn't make him stronger. Now, what did make him stronger? Well, that reading that we had from the proverb, and realizing this about our God: vindication. We become shattered in the trauma, but our outlook becomes unbreakable. Healing is not a return to who we were before. In fact, in the nature of some losses, you can never go back to the experience. And as life is, those experiences were maybe not meant to be prolonged any longer than they were. These are the things that we don't know. But what is interesting is Job stands back with his trauma while appealing to God, how can this be? Why would this be? And what does this mean? And then God doesn't answer. He says, I'm the God of heaven. I made all that you see and hear and all that is before you. And your healing is not a return to where you were, but your healing is coming from what's in front of you. And then God he just says, I'm going to show myself and you better get ready, because you're going to have to stand up and answer like a man. And that is a person with intestinal fortitude to take it. In verse 5, I've heard of you with the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. The trauma minimized. He was healed. I know it emotionally sounds a little too quick, but Job said, I know that you can do everything and that no purpose of yours can be withheld from you. You ask, who is this who hides counsel without knowledge? That's us. We don't know. I've uttered things I don't understand, things too wonderful for me which I did not know. Listen, please, you said, and let me speak. You said, I will question you, you will answer me, and so here's his answer. I've heard of you, but now I see. Job was vindicated in all that he experienced. He thought that something was wrong, and then God shows up and says, wait a minute, life occurs. Time and chance occur. And Satan seeks to steal, kill, and destroy through temptation. And in his circumstance, it was, permitted. In our view, it's what we know, that things did happen. But the growth occurs when we stop demanding all the abstract answers for why bad things happen and instead integrate the experience into our firsthand reality. This is the way it is. And this is where God cares for us. He hasn't left us. The God of this world seeks to destroy, to steal, to kill, and destroy. But Christ came that we have life, and that more abundantly. And that abundant life is suddenly, even through trauma, even standing in the ashes. We come before a God of heaven that demands emotional, spiritual honesty. And think of this, when God at the end of the book is dealing with his friends who gave him some pretty terrible views of himself and God. God preferred Job's raw honesty over some disingenuous piety. And that's why we look at the church and we don't want the pretend. All have sinned and come short of the glory of God. And the traumatic event is our complaint, because things are beyond our control. In suffering, we seek relief right now. But that's not reality, because there are many things that we do not control. And so we must take thoughts and steps. Identify the grief and the anger, whatever it is. Intentionally become swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath, and begin seeking peace and pursue it. And as you go through this process, you'll ask yourself, what about tomorrow? And that'll trigger the trauma. Unless you can hold to that one prevailing principle. Sufficient unto the day is its own trouble. Seek the kingdom. Seek to be in the light. Seek those who are of like precious faith. Those who come to God, knowing God knows. They know that God is, and that he is a rewarder of those that diligently seek him. Are you that one? You see, victory over trauma, faith in the dark, truly is manifest in the most beautiful way, far beyond anything we can comprehend. Because the Lord restored Job's losses when he prayed for his friends. Forgiveness. He makes intercession, and there's restoration. And you go to Peter, and he says that you are born again, not of corruptible seed, incorruptible seed, through sincere love of the brethren. There's his friends. And they're hashing this thing out. And here we are, working through this thing. And if we can't forgive each other, how can we ever be released from our own trauma? The human relationship is designed by God. And we lose that in trauma because other things, events. And so we're traumatized. And thus all of those feelings, all those connectors, all that spiritual truth is now lost. It's beyond us. But God before him. They go from this to this. And isn't that what we want? Just to have a good day, a good relationship, a good meal. Isn't that the simple things of life that just we all yearn? And yet we've brought so much trauma and losing our faith when we experience trials. The path of the righteous is like the morning sun, shining ever brighter till the full of day. It's a process, not a fast process. The process of restoration, moving beyond trials, requires intentional steps. Reconciliation, personal peace, these things are not spontaneous. They're intentional. The challenges faced are not meaningless. They strengthen character. They refine our resilience, get us to communicate. Job and his friends had a lot to say about each other, and God gave them this beautiful answer that enabled them to be at one with God and at one with each other. The final verdict: suffering and trauma do not define your identity. A disability does not define your identity. True renewal and enduring peace are always achievable. Your identity is faith and hope and love within you. And I remind those ladies in the nursing home every Sunday, you can lose everything, but they can't have that. Looking ahead with hope, this newfound strength, the path forward, you have the light. I've got more slides, but I'm not going to try to get through them. But man, this is the key, because in that trauma, there has to be a sense where out of the ashes comes a renewed purpose and hope. And that's what Job found when he saw God. He didn't see God until he had to get rid of the trauma. And the shared journey, that's us. Yeah, our friends, the church, we get it wrong a lot. We see something happen, we give advice, and it's our perception or our trauma speaking for yours. And let's just return to God. Let's return, and that's where we're going to find peace. 2610 Reservoir Road, Sunday, 9:30 Bible study, 10:30 worship, and then at 5 o'clock. This topic, hopefully, will get expanded a little bit in the full sermon. Love you. Thank you so much for joining me. If I can help you, contact me. You can message me. The phone number is my direct text line if you need me. We're going to make it. We're going to make it together. That's God's plan, and it can be a reality, but we got to get through some things.